All right, so we talked about the presentation dates, the homework assignment 15, which previously appeared onto the class schedule, that's canceled. And then there will be an optional review session for the exam next Friday at 2, so immediately after class. And then the final will be the Friday after that, 2 weeks from today. In fact, 2 weeks from today, you'll be already underway for the final exam. And so any questions related to the announcements? Let's talk about hazardous waste. And it's important around here because there are a lot of chemical plants in West Virginia. The corridor between Huntington and Charleston is sometimes described as Chemical Valley, especially between Nitro and Charleston. There's a lot of active chemical plants there, and historically, going back as far as World War I, there was a lot of chemical production in fields including explosives and substances that are potentially toxic. So it's important because we've got proximity to a lot of chemical plants, and there's also proximity to rivers, which have a way of carrying chemical contamination towards the sources of water that we use for drinking. So in Charleston, they get their drinking water from the Elk River. Here in Huntington, we get our drinking water from the Ohio River. And just to kick off the discussion of hazardous waste, we'll talk about this spill of MCHM that occurred back in 2014. And I asked the water treatment plant operator about that when we were visiting the water treatment plant here in Huntington. I didn't realize it was that long ago. It's been more than a decade since that spill. There was a company that distributed chemicals used in the coal industry called Freedom Industries. And they had a facility in Charleston that consisted of 14 above-ground storage tanks with a total overall combined capacity of 4 million gallons. And just the way the regulations are for the storage of chemicals, it varies a little bit from state to state, but a lot of the responsibility for inspecting and reporting the condition of facilities like this are just put on the owners and operators of the facility. There's very little independent monitoring and inspection of chemical storage locations like this. In fact, this facility, which had a chemical spill in 2014, hadn't been inspected since 1991. So it had been a good long time since any independent auditor was on site to investigate. Now, of course, chemical companies have an incentive to not have the thing they're selling spill because, if it's a valuable product that's expensive for them to buy and they're making profits by selling it, you'd think that there'd be enough of incentive just to make sure that their tanks aren't going to leak because of that. But it's expensive to repair, like when a chemical tank starts to get old and maybe it's got cracks you don't know about. Like a visual inspection is one thing, but there can be imperfections due to welds that were never good in the first place, that had maybe voids in the weld. There can be flaws that arise over time due to the weathering cycle, due to the freeze and thaw or differential settlement of the soil that the foundation of the tank is on as the soil settles on one side of the tank but maybe not on the other side. That can put an additional stress on the tank, and so these flaws aren't always visible. But what happened on January 9th, 2014 is that sometime in the early morning hours, a hole opened up on a tank that was storing a chemical called MCHM, which is used for washing of coal that is going to be used for coking, for steel production. And Freedom Industries is here on the Elk River, 1.5 miles upstream of the intakes for the West Virginia American Water, drinking water treatment plant. So on the day of the spill, there was only a depth of about 7 feet of water. This river is much, much smaller than the Ohio River where our Huntington water comes from. So the water moves more slowly, there's less volume, and so the spill that occurred, if I remember correctly, was about 7,500 gallons of this chemical MCHM, and nobody at Freedom Industries reported the spill. It was reported by residents in the area who noticed kind of a licorice scent. It was a smell, an unusual smell. People called into 911, and so the fire department and state EPA, Department of Environmental Protection, started to look around trying to follow the source of the smell, and that's how they eventually tracked it down, was just by following their noses. And they eventually identified that one of the tanks had a hole of several inches in it. It was leaking this chemical, and when they arrived, there was a cinder block and a 50-pound bag of just an absorbent, like the kind of thing that the powder that they would throw on a ketchup spill at Walmart to try and like solidify it and then sweep it up. But there were no people around. They weren't like actively trying to clean up the spill. I mean, they claimed that they were, but the independent inspectors later on reported that nobody was really doing anything about the spill as that toxic chemical got into the water. So it got downstream. Here's the inlet at West Virginia American Water. It wasn't until about 5 o'clock that day that they finally announced that the water wasn't safe. For the first couple of hours, they thought that their activated carbon was going to be able to remove the spill, but pretty quickly their activated carbon was overwhelmed, and they were starting to notice the symptoms, the smell of that chemical in their finished water. And so they made the decision that at 4 o'clock they were going to have to tell people not to use the water, and the word finally got out about 5:45. And it started spreading mainly through the news media and word of mouth. Back then, the water company wasn't very good about contacting people directly. They had this silly technique of just leaving tags on people's doors if they needed to boil their water, or if there was a water emergency. They had to physically distribute these door tags. And this is back at a time when, you know, every elementary school in the area had an automated way of calling people to say, you know, like things like 2-hour delay today, don't send your kids to the bus stop. But yet the water company, it took them about a decade to get similar technology for emergencies like this. So this went on for weeks and weeks. It had huge impacts on 8 counties were affected. Schools were canceled, businesses were closed, a state of emergency was declared throughout the areas that were serviced by that drinking water treatment plant there in Charleston. And as you might expect, there was a big run on bottled water. They had to be bringing it in. The National Guard was activated to help distribute clean water. And lines formed where people couldn't use their existing water. Even with boiling, it wasn't safe to drink. They couldn't bathe with it. And so some of the symptoms that people mentioned was difficulty breathing, burning eyes, rashes on their skin. Hospital were closed, elective surgeries, and in fact, even there was somebody who was supposed to get a kidney transplant that day. Their surgery was canceled. So it had a big impact on companies that are supposed to be open and operational for weeks. They had to stay closed, or they had to somehow track down bottled water for their customers. And here's the president of Freedom Industries. His story changed a lot over the course of the few days after the incident, and ultimately he was sentenced to 30 days in federal prison and a $20,000 fine. So he didn't get off the hook completely, but he definitely didn't pay full restitution for all of the economic damage. If you think you're shutting down the capital of the state and affecting hundreds of thousands of people for weeks and weeks, a $20,000 fine in some ways kind of feels like just a slap on the wrist. So here are some of the symptoms that were reported from people, and I think that this is a percentage. You know, like of those who were reporting symptoms, this is what the distribution of symptoms were. So it is mainly skin related. People who had exposed, like taken a shower, but there were some people who had ingested it and reported vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal discomfort, and so on. So the water company had to offer people a credit for flushing out their lines. After the chemical had worked its way down the river, the problem was that they told people to stop using their water. And so you had all this contaminated water in the pipes through the distribution network and in people's homes. So they had to have some flushing. So they told everybody that they would give them a credit of 1,000 gallons in order to encourage people to just turn on the water, flush out the system to try to get the remaining MCHM out of the distribution network. So eventually the company that did the spill declared bankruptcy, and in doing so they avoided the consequences of several lawsuits that had been filed. Ironically, Lexicon LLC was opened a couple of months later by a former Freedom Industries executive having the same business address, and then within a year had racked up a bunch of safety violations, and so kind of a discouraging illustration of how easy it is to avoid responsibility when it comes to environmental crimes, because companies really don't have any incentive to not cut corners and take risks, because it's expensive. Environmental compliance is expensive, and so if they can just cut corners and take the risks, when the worst does happen, like it did here, they just declare bankruptcy, and all of the profits that they'd been taking over the years, they keep the profits because the profits flow to the owners, but the liability for the environmental incident is owned by the corporation or the LLC that owns the facility, and then they can just walk away from the problem and put the burden for cleanup and the health expenses onto the general public. And so health insurance companies and the water company, they incur expenses that the people who'd been taking profits over years and years for operating this chemical sales company don't really bear any responsibility. So that's pretty frustrating. What's also frustrating is that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Like, there had been incidents prior to this spill in 2014. There was an explosion at the chemical facility, a DuPont facility. There was an incident at Bayer Crop Science. So all these previous incidents had precipitated like an external investigation. There was an internal investigation in 2011, and it was the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board, the CSB. So they came in, they offered some recommendations to the state on changes that should be made for like increased inspection, more safety, and those recommendations that were offered by the CSB was rejected by the West Virginia legislature, and so they never initiated the changes that would have prevented this. So that's also frustrating that it was preventable, but it was just maybe laxness or not wanting to come across as unfriendly to business. Typical knee-jerk excuses why they didn't actually implement appropriate recommendations. So it's an interesting case study that illustrates the consequences of exposure to hazardous waste. So, like, what is a hazardous waste? The government has a list of chemicals of hazardous waste, and then also there are categories of things that are considered hazardous waste, whether or not they appear on this list. So this is the Code of Federal Regulations, and there's different types of lists. There's what's called an F list, a K list, a P list, a U list. So we just look at what some of these things are on the list. This is part of the F list here. So tetrachloroethylene, trichloroethylene, methylene chloride. It just goes on and on. These are chemicals which are known to be dangerous to human health. And it's a pretty lengthy list. The F list are chemicals that are used in a variety of different industries in general. That's like what characterizes F list chemicals, is they call it a non-specific source. That just means that the chemical is used in more than one sector of industrial activity, whereas K-list chemicals are more clustered to certain types of industries. And so K-list chemicals maybe are clustered around petroleum refinery or explosives manufacturing or so on. So if we compare some of these chemicals, some of them would be observed in a variety of different industries. That was the F list. I think if we go a little bit lower, here's the K list chemicals. So you can see if it's across a variety of different categories of chemicals, it's very lengthy here. Pesticides, explosives, petroleum refinery, iron and steel. So you'd find out like what industry you're in, veterinary, pharmaceuticals, and so then any kind of discharge related to, here you can see distillation tar residue from the distillation of aniline-based compounds in the production of veterinary pharmaceuticals from arsenic or organo-arsenic compounds. It's pretty specific, but that's the sort of thing that I guess is common in each of these different sectors. Then the P and U chemicals are basically pure chemicals that maybe are being disposed of as excess or expired. So it's not that this is a residue of some sort from production. The other things are residues from production. So it's kind of like an unintended consequence. But the P and U chemicals are the pure compounds that maybe just aren't needed anymore, and so they're the leftovers. So each one of these is on a list because it's known to be dangerous, but hazardous chemicals can also be considered hazardous just based on their characteristics. And so even if it's not on one of those lists, but it's ignitable, then it's considered a hazardous waste, and it's not suitable for disposal in a municipal landfill. So ignitable is different from flammable. You know, like wood or paper doesn't classify as ignitable. Ignitable is something where it has some volatility to it. So gasoline, for example, is ignitable. But just solid compounds, which can be burned but aren't prone to ignition just from their vapors, wouldn't be considered ignitable. Things that are corrosive are considered hazardous and therefore should be kept out of a municipal landfill because they could cause damage to the leachate collection system. So if there are pumps that are removing leachate and they're exposed to like acidic or corrosive materials, then that could damage the landfill's ability to collect the leachate. Or it could potentially get through the liner. So chemicals that are corrosive are considered hazardous, reactive, toxic, and so toxicity can be determined from animal studies, and based on how animals respond to different concentrations of chemicals, then there will be a certain level below which the concentration has to be kept for it to be considered a hazardous waste. So anything that had more than 5 milligrams per liter of arsenic would be considered a hazardous waste because of the amount of arsenic it has. So it doesn't have to be pure arsenic, but anything that has more than 5 milligrams per liter, like if we're talking about a liquid, would be considered a hazardous waste at that point on the basis of its toxicity. There's something in evaluating the danger of chemicals called LD50. And LD50 is the lethal dose that would kill 50% of a population. And so this is a comparison of different types of chemicals, and the LD50 per milligram of chemical constituent per kilogram of body mass. And so, for example, the most dangerous ones are those which would have the lowest LD50, because it requires a really small amount in terms of milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So Botox, botulism toxin, is the most acutely lethal because it only takes 0.00001 milligrams of Botox per kilogram of body weight to be toxic. Ironically, this botulism toxin is what they put into wrinkles to kind of like, have you ever seen people who their faces, they're old and they obviously should have wrinkles, but they don't? It's sometimes because they've got the Botox injected, and the toxin, it paralyzes the nerves, and so they sometimes aren't able to have like normal facial expressions. If they've had it in their foreheads, they can't really move their face around very much because their skin is paralyzed, but it makes the wrinkles go away. But ironically, it's very, very toxic. Dioxin is a chemical which can be formed when plastic is burned, especially at low temperatures. Nicotine is pretty toxic, 1 milligram per kilogram of body weight. So, there's a concern sometimes that small children with nicotine gum or nicotine patches, if they ingested a lot of it, then it could be dangerous. And so what this is saying is that 1 milligram of nicotine per kilogram of body weight. So if you had a baby that was 20 kilograms that ate several pieces of nicotine gum, potentially that could be enough to cause an acutely lethal dose. So acutely means in the short term. Like, it's not that you'd need years and years of exposure. It's like you take one dose and you're dead. So the higher the LD50 amount, then that means that it would require more of it for half of a population to die acutely. So the other interesting thing that we can do to look at the hazardous waste is not just the risk of their acute toxicity, or some of these have the potential for being carcinogenic, but also if you combine them together, there can be unexpected consequences, like it can generate heat, it can generate fumes. And this table, this is something that occasionally you'll see questions on the FE exam where you're asking to combine different types of substances together and then find out what would be the reaction. So I'm going to give you an in-class exercise today where we're going to go through this table and see, for example, what if you combined an ether with an acid. So category 1 is an acid. Ether is category 13. And if you find the intersection with category 1 and category 13, it says that what will form is heat. So H, heat generation. So sometimes nothing will happen, like if you combine category 4, which is an alcohol. If you can combine alcohol with ether, there's no reaction from that. But what would be the worst case scenario? Explosion, E. So you have the potential for explosion if you have metals with halogenated organics. So category 17, halogenated organics, take it down here to 21, metal, alkali, and alkaline earth elemental. So for example, magnesium and where were we with that one? Explosions, 17, halogenated organics. So halogenated means like if it has a chlorine on the end of, so a common halogenated organic is dry cleaning fluid. Dry cleaning fluid is used for like fabrics that you don't want to get wet with water, so you may take your suit to get dry cleaned. And so trichloroethylene is halogenated organic. It's an organic compound, meaning it has carbon molecules, but then it also has a chlorine on there. So I'm going to give you this in-class exercise so you can get some practice using these hazard analysis. Let me pull it up on the screen here. Okay, so for the case of aldehydes and caustics, so if we start with aldehydes, that's category 5, and then we go down from category 5 and intercept caustics, that's the letter H. It's kind of hard to see. This isn't the sharpest. I apologize for the quality of the image. But aldehydes down to caustics, it's going to generate heat. So that's the answer to number 1 is heat. Okay, number 2 is asking, your boss says it's okay to store cyanide and alkali earth together. There's no ventilation needed. Is he wrong? So let's just look at, in the case of cyanides and alkali earth. So here's cyanide, category 11. Go down until we find alkali earth. That's category 21. So the interception here has GF, which is flammable gas generation. So yeah, we'd want to ventilate that. We wouldn't want to generate flammable gas without some kind of ventilation. Okay, question number 3. What about isocyanates and dithiocarbamates? Okay, so isocyanates and dicarbothiamates. That's category 12. Okay, so category 12 down to isocyanates, U. It says may be hazardous, but unknown. Okay, we don't know. That's interesting. Why don't they just try it out? Let's just get creative, right? I guess maybe it depends on, like sometimes it goes one way, sometimes it goes the other. I don't know. I don't know what that unknown means, but I'm intrigued. All right, category 4. Problem 4. What should be your storage system prepared for if you plan to have caustics, aldehydes, and ethers? Okay, so let's see. We have to look at caustics and aldehydes, caustics and ethers and aldehydes. And that's all of the combinations, right? There's only 3 combinations: caustic, aldehyde, caustic, ether, aldehydes. Okay, so in the case of caustics and aldehydes, we need to start with aldehydes. Okay, category 5, go down to caustics, heat. Okay, caustics and ethers. So here's ethers and caustics. So category 10 down to ethers, nothing. And ethers and aldehydes. So aldehyde, Category 5 down to ether, nothing. So of those combinations, the only thing that we need to be ready for is heat. All right, so that's it, actually. That's it. I'm not going to teach you another thing all semester. Next week, you're going to be teaching the class, right? I guess I'll maybe teach you something in the review session if you come to that a week from today. But let's just revisit these announcements one last time. You've got the review session on Friday. Remember that you need to upload your presentation file at least an hour before class on the day of your presentation. So that's it. I'll see you next week.